Welcome to the Project Censored Show on Pacifica Radio. I'm your host, Mickey Huff, with Eleanor Goldfield. Today on the program, in this segment, we are honored to welcome to the show Omar Zahzah. Omar is an organizer, writer, poet, and freelance journalist of Lebanese Palestinian descent, as well as an assistant professor of Arab, Muslim ethnicities, and diasporas studies at San Francisco State University in California. Omar's book, Terms of Servitude: Zionism, Silicon Valley, and Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle, is forthcoming from the Censored Press and Seven Stories Press in the summer of 2025. We'll talk a little bit about that today. Omar has been a contributor to such outlets as Electronic Intifada, Mondoweiss, and Palestine Chronicle. And today we will be talking about his forthcoming book, Terms of Servitude, and we'll start by talking about a recent piece at the Palestine Chronicle called The Weaponization of Identity: Twitch Prohibits Criticism of Zionism. And before we get into that, Omar Zahzah, welcome to the Project Censored Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's an honor and a delight to have you. But we were talking about an extraordinary, ongoing, very heavy topic. And not only do you teach about these topics, but you've been publishing about them for years. And you're an expert and specialist on the terms of servitude issue, on the sort of the confluence of big tech, the surveillance state, and the ongoing genocide in Gaza. So, Omar Zahzah, let's at least start with some of the tech criticism that you have, and let's talk about your piece recently in Palestine Chronicle, where you talk about connections are being drawn for us, and the increasing accommodation of Zionism in public spaces must continue to be the subject of massive, ongoing opposition. So relate that to what you're talking about here with the weaponization of identity, Omar Zahzah.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Mickey. So, first of all, I guess I'll start by saying I was a little taken aback, and maybe this is an error to admit on my part. I've been following these things as closely as I can, but and yet something about Twitch coming out and doing this just seemed a little bit random. As a gaming platform, and what's become a bigger streaming platform, I was a little bit surprised. Like, why would you weigh in on this? But of course, streamers, had been using the platform to really address, questions of Palestine for some time. And, this is part of what happens when you're engaging in kind of advancing, a Palestinian narrative that offsets the kind of hegemonic narrative we tend to see from corporate media spaces. And I guess we'll get a little bit into the presumed distinction between digital spaces and, these legacy corporate media spaces. But in any case, part of, good narrative resistance is using any platform at your disposal to start mounting these forms of dissent and critique. But I was still somewhat taken aback to see that at this moment in time, I believe it was November 15th when I read it, this had come out. Twitch had decided that they were going to take this stance in their hateful conduct policy and basically update it to include Zionist as a potential slur, right? And for me, it's not just about Twitch specifically, not just about the specificity of that platform, but what is disturbing to me is that this is becoming an increasingly normalized action that prominent digital platforms are taking, that they're incorporating into their community standards. And of course, I think it's important to kind of take a step back and not necessarily take community standards as something that has its own kind of authentic integrity, because this is also kind of a corporate neologism, right? That we're sort of being sold. But to basically talk about criticism of a colonial ideology and a colonial project, to incorporate that as something that is potentially quote unquote hateful, right? Which ultimately represents the weaponization of civil rights frameworks, of anti-racist frameworks, in order to actually inoculate against the pursuance of anti-racist expression, of anti-colonial expression. So the very, ideological mechanisms that were developed to actually advance anti-racism are now being used to silence anti-racist and anti-colonial expressions on digital platforms that very hypocritically kind of market themselves as the alternatives, to other forms of media that we get in our day-to-day lives. So I just felt that what we're seeing is an increasingly normalized process whereby these community standards in and of themselves become a new tool of anti-Palestinian suppression and silencing and censorship. And I thought it was important to name that as quickly as possible because so many of these things are happening in real time. And I think even as my initial reaction suggested, it's easy to say, well, this is just one gaming platform. This is just one thing. Who cares? Who uses that? I'm not even on it. I'm not even a Twitch user necessarily, but it is really important to be aware of these developments. And I think about how they fall in line into broader patterns of repression and censorship and silencing.
Well, Omar, the Twitch is just an example, as you said, and you mismentioned, you're not even on it, and well, what might it matter? But when you take a step back and you look across big tech platforms, I mean, this is the trend. This is a pattern. This isn't a one-off. And I think, you point this out in your piece, which was published November 25th. And it says, Twitch talks about their quote, hateful conduct policy to prohibit criticism of Zionists and Zionism. And then they go through some, you already mentioned the word euphemism, kind of invoking George Carlin there and his, let's have one standard, let's not have double standards. One standard will do just fine. Speaking of community standards. But they're trying to wrap this up in terms of hate speech to prohibit any kind of actual criticism. And then they go some convoluted, labyrinthian way of kind of saying, this is what's not okay. This is what is okay. And, as you note in the article, you go on and saying like, right, that's the not so subtle takeaway is it's best to avoid supporting Palestine and ongoing Israeli genocide on our platform. That's kind of how you interpreted it, all of their sort of neoliberal professional managerial class tech speak, for lack of a more concise adjective there. But can you talk about can you talk about what's so insidious about this kind of a policy, the way it's instituted, and the chilling effect that it actually can cause?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I think I'll kind of start with the way that you were setting up the question, because I think you're exactly right. What I was trying to get at is if you look at this policy, you read it word for word, it is very mealy-mouthed. It is honestly, and I wrote this, right? It's nonsensical on its face, but it's kind of easy to get lost in the weeds of making fun of that or pointing out, how it doesn't really hold together very well, when in reality, that kind of nonsensicality is precisely the point because you're going to read this, it's going to be so confusing, it's going to be so impossible to really come out with a takeaway aside from, well, this is just too confusing or too complicated, and I'm not going to do this, right? That's ultimately supposed to be the broader point. So what seems to be an expression of kind of ineptitude is actually an ideological technology of suppression, right? Because it kind of nudges you in the way that a lot of digital platforms generally nudge people into doing things that you might not have otherwise done, right? If you see this now, a lot of people who do this work, are not put off by this. This isn't exactly the highest strata of repression that you could ever experience, but it is still something that might give people pause. And I think it's important to name it as such. The other aspect of the insidiousness of it is, again, to go back to this neologism of the community standard, right? Like there's really no community, that has large corporate platforms and the most marginalized to the most privileged, all as really inherently equal players. And so, these community standards really reflect the kind of unspoken codes that people need to adhere to in order to be able to use these platforms that ultimately reinforce already existing hierarchies, of political and social repression, oppression, and marginalization, including, unfortunately, the settler colonial project, that the Israeli state has practiced from its inception, to the current moment, which we're seeing unfold in genocide. And so what these platforms that have sort of presented themselves as being alternatives have increasingly become is places where the sociopolitical inequities that exist in the quote unquote real world are kind of being normalized in these new spaces as well and taken for granted. And it's something that we need to accept if we're going to be part of a community, right, that is given the privilege of using these platforms. And I think that is insidious, not just because of what it means for one platform to do it, but because they're establishing a creeping norm. And when one big platform does it, it signals to another that, hey, this is the way to do it. This is the way to maintain your business, to maintain your success, to maintain your capture, of this broad population. And I think that the fact that Twitch has done it again, it's not just about Twitch. It signals that more and more, platforms are going to be kind of taking this, as far as their modus operandi.
Well, Omar Zaza, you did write previously about Meta, Facebook, Instagram. We see this in moving from the digital tech space to even the legacy media space. The New York Times, not so subtly, was telling their reporters that they weren't allowed to use certain words in the context of what was going on to the Palestinians. So that pattern has jumped technologies, that kind of oppression, that kind of framing, right, is I think pretty significant. And we've been dancing around one of the terms here, and I just wanted to bring it up. Whose community exactly do we belong to? I mean, whose community is being represented here on these platforms, Omar Zaza? And if it's supposedly a community for all, that doesn't appear to be represented in the kinds of policies that are now very deliberately being imposed in I mean I mean they're draconian policies in a way in terms of outcome that they will ultimately ostracize and prohibit people's use or maybe even worse if that follows them outside the platform. But talk a little bit more about this propagandistic ruse of community standards in this context, if you could.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think ultimately what we're seeing is, as you rightly pointed out, this isn't a real community, or this isn't about, a collective of real communities. So, I mean, what these community standards increasingly represent is this very abstracted idea of community that ultimately really means consumers, right? And corporate purveyors, overlords, however you want to phrase it, right? It's basically the people who are given access to the platform under very particular conditions, including the increasing running list of things that they cannot say or types of speech that they cannot engage in. And, they use this framework of community to really make it seem as though these things that are ultimately just user agreements have a deeper kind of moral or ethical depth to them, right? And of course, there's certain things, like particular modes of enforcing anti-racism that I think generally speaking people would agree, that makes sense. There's some things you might say are problematic, but by and large, what we're actually seeing happen is it's really not about stopping repressive speech or other forms of marginalization so much as really couching what is a political act of silencing against communities that take to these platforms to advance their various anti oppressive struggles under the guise of saying, well, you just need to play nice with each other. This is a community after all, right? So it really becomes about a kind of corporate ideal of not having any sort of friction, right? Because I mean, of course, if you look at the Israeli state, you look at the Zionist project, it's something that is completely, basically, largely unobstructedly manifesting itself in genocide at this current moment. There's no danger of large scale suppression. And yet we're being told that the ways that people use certain terms on platforms could be tantamount to, some kind of a form of discrimination, which is really just laughable. I mean, look at who has the power in this equation, right? And look at who doesn't have power and who's trying to take to as many different spaces as possible to really advance a particular way of seeing their struggle as something that is very much rooted in an anti-colonial ethos of collective liberation. So, community standards, again, I think I could say this on and on and on. It's really a way of kind of in this Kafkaesque fashion masking the suppression of marginalized voices fighting for liberation, masking their suppression as something that is just in the best interest of this presumed abstracted ideal community of friends, where all kind of power differentials are neutralized, right? Which just has no actual purchase in reality.
Yeah, Omar, your first chapter of the book, I mean, which will be out next summer, and we'll certainly be talking about it more, and we'll have you on naturally when the publication is nearer. Your very first chapter really addresses this issue and refusing the language of silence. Can you just encapsulate that concept for us?
Yeah, thank you so much. And so, I mean, refusing the language of silence, really the one of the first chapters of Terms of Servitude, is a chapter where, and I was kind of conflicted about this because, obviously with genocide unfolding, you know, even as though I am somebody who has, Palestinian heritage and identifies as Palestinian, you don't necessarily want to make yourself front and center. But that is a piece where I wrote about some of the challenges of really focusing simply on social media in an active moment of genocide, where it seems as though you're just seeing, the reality of genocide unfold in real time in all of its rapidity, unobstructed, um, and seeing that despite all of the repression, still so meticulously documented, seeing such harrowing images and recordings, and thinking really through the question of what do you do when you are confronted with that, right? There is a way that you can just simply kind of succumb to the weight and just say that there's nothing that I have to add, right, to that. And so for me, that was one level of the language of silence where it's just not saying anything seems the only logical, even the only sane response, when there's so much that should already be able to speak to themselves. But of course, as Edward Said once noted in Permission to Narrate, in the case of Palestine, the facts have never been able to speak for themselves, right? And so part of what I came out on the other end with in that piece is the idea of we need to continue declaiming, right, and mounting this outcry against the increasing normalization of censorship that these platforms, that are the very platforms that people are taking to express, the realities of genocide, as well as their opposition to an ongoing project of settler colonization, the increasing normalization of these platforms engaging in anti-Palestinian censorship, we need to continue to mount that outcry. And we need to refuse the language of silence on that level, to say that not only will we not be silent in the face of genocide, we will not be silent in the face of this increasingly sanctioned silencing that these platforms are practicing.
Omar, Zahzah, we were just talking before the break about your piece in the Palestine Chronicle. I wouldn't even be able to probably read the title of your book if I were on Twitch, uh, given their speech codes, as we'll call them. In the previous half of the show here, where we were, or segment when we were just talking with you, you talked about, we were talking about the chilling effects. We were talking about silencing. We were talking about some of the nonsensical nature of these kinds of Kafkaesque policies. When it comes to the social media kind of censorship and the kind of things we saw at the New York Times, I mean, it's textbook Orwellian in the way in which they're literally trying to rewrite. They're trying to tell you aren't seeing things with your own two eyes. And of course, that also, this is something we've talked about several times, and I wanted to kind of bring this back to you since we've talked about Meta a little bit, Facebook, Instagram, Twitch. We certainly don't want to leave TikTok out of it because TikTok has gotten some really heightened attention this past year because people like Secretary of State Anthony Blinken and Senator Mitt Romney said the quiet part out loud about the reason that they wanted to ban TikTok was basically because they couldn't control the platform. It was owned by a Chinese company, ByteDance, and they specifically said that they weren't happy about the content that young people were accessing on the platform, specifically related to what was happening in Gaza. So, in other words, they just want to turn off the channel. I mean, again, you mentioned this, and we talked about it too. We're this is if you seek the sources, not on corporate media, but if you seek the independent journalists and the people on the ground that are being killed in Gaza, I think it's 200 journalists, people doing journalism there dead within the last, from the last year, that number now. And the number of civilian casualties and dead people is like up to 45,000 at least, right? But we have policies that are trying to shut down any kind of information that's showing people what's actually happening. In the censored book 2025 this year that just came out, we have a couple of stories on this in the top 25, no surprise. But throughout the entire book, we couldn't help but reference the many different signposts of authoritarian control of information around this issue that are well advanced, all in progress, and they show no signs of abatement. So I was just curious if you might talk a little bit about, and again, it's a dual-edged sword, right? Big tech. TikTok has same issues and problems as all the other tech platforms, but they weren't going after Facebook or Instagram on that issue. And we know that there are other negative things about all these big tech companies and so forth that also would apply to TikTok. But in this case, it's a platform that's getting information out that isn't available to people from other avenues. So, taking good, bad, with the ugly of the Silicon Valley landscape, and as far as information control and dystopian control of information. Omar Zahzah, what do you make of that? And that young people are responding to that through social media?
Yeah, yeah, no, it's a great question, and I mean TikTok is such an interesting example. Um, I think there's several ways to go about it. I mean, first of all, yeah, this is a completely draconian ban, and it's also one that just really makes clear the kind of imperialist politic that underlies all of this, right? Because ultimately, it would have to sell to an American company, right? That's the nature of how the mechanisms of the way the ban is enforced, right? I mean, and so you just have this clear kind of imperial business edge that is kind of cooked into this, right? But at the same time, there is definitely the use of the language of kind of a moral panic about this in terms of, singling it out for the content creators that are focusing on Palestine. I think with platforms, each new platform is going to do something slightly different and they're going to hone themselves in particular ways. So TikTok, and again, I'm a millennial. I'm not super on TikTok. I mean, I look at it but the ways that it uses images and the way that it uses even kind of video, right, to sort of send its messaging, honing it in this kind of increasingly uh, new way that is unique to that platform. That's something that reveals the ways in which, this is a platform that has really honed its kind of brand and its style for generating content, right? So now it's impossible to do something and not think of TikTok as kind of a referent for that, right? And so, of course, with this platform that has a much younger demographic, people have started to find ways to kind of um, let's say, work within the algorithm to advance Palestine messaging, right? And of course, because it's young people that are on it, it's more young people that are going to be turning to it. And of course, then there starts to be this kind of fabricated narrative about it is this app that is making people pro-Palestine. But in reality, the way all social media works, of course, it's what are you looking for? What are you using? How can we kind of fine-tune an algorithm to make sure that you're getting more and more of that content, right? TikTok in and of itself, at the end of the day, is a company, concerned with its own success, right? Not agreeing with what the U.S. is doing in terms of forcing, it to be sold, not agreeing, obviously, with the kind of Zionist logic that is saying that it's too pro-Palestine, we need to shut it down. But we also don't necessarily want to fall into the trap of saying, like, yes, this is the pro-Palestine platform. One of the takeaways that I've really learned from working on terms of servitude, or I should say, been reminded of, is it's really not the platforms. It's the brilliance and the creative, utility that is applied by all of the people acting in resistance and dissent to advance the Palestinian narratives, despite vast repression and so many struggles and setbacks. That's where the focus really needs to go. It's all of these brilliant people, from the young to, let's say any other generation who happens to be able to use it, who is using TikTok in this way. They are the heroes of this story. It's not the apps, it's not the platforms, it's not the companies. But people are seeing that there is just an untenable position in terms of the public response to Palestine at this point in time, where genocide is undeniable, where the inherently violent core, right, not an accidental outgrowth, the core of Zionism is on full display for the world. And they're panicking about this. So they're looking to all of the ways that they can point fingers. Let's start with this company that is kind of our imperial rival, right? We're going to start there. But eventually it's also going to run down the line. What else are they going to find, right? I mean, if you look at Israel, for example, I believe Netanyahu once said we have two enemies, it's Haaretz and the New York Times. And of course, you were just saying, like, what are the issues with the New York Times is reporting? It's very, very, it's anti-Palestinian in a lot of ways. And so it's really this question of what are the stories that we can cook up to hide the fact that we're just losing control of the narrative, right? On this increasingly kind of precipitous slope. And so right now, TikTok is going to be the scapegoat for that. It's important to see through it, but it's also really important to remember that it's not the apps, it's the people using the apps. It's the Palestinians, right? The Palestinians in Gaza, the Palestinians, in Palestine in 48, right? Palestinians in the West Bank, in diaspora, and all of their allies that are using these platforms to advance an anti-colonial narrative. That's where our focus needs to be, and on opposing the increasingly normalized censorship that they are facing for taking to these platforms to do this important work.
Well, Omar, Zahzah, all excellent points, and certainly historically important to note and contextually. And we have 7, 8 minutes left, so I wanted to turn our attention a little bit to some of the other things that you talk about in your forthcoming book, Terms of Servitude. In particular, the other part of this, right, is that these kind of social media platforms, anti-social media sometimes, they don't just algorithmically, take people places and de facto curate or censor information. Andy Roth, the Project Censored, has been doing really great work on algorithmic literacy that people can find at our site that talks about how this is and how few people even realize how they're being manipulated through their own confirmation biases, what they can do about it, the problems that we've talked about too with code of conduct issues or people being deplatformed, demonetized, shadow banned. Andy's been writing a lot about that, and it pertains very much to the topic of your book. And when we talk about terms of servitude, surveillance is a big part of this. These platforms are data harvesters, and they can also surveil in some ways. But these same tech companies that have these platforms often are invested in or have revolving door directorates with the national security state, not just in the United States, but of course around the world, including in Israel, right? Um, could you talk a little bit? I mean, I'm just going to rattle off a list of some of these kind of programs. You talk about them at the outset of your book, but things like, projects like Canary Mission, right? For example, like let's remind some of our listeners here of it's a brief list, but it could be even longer. What is Canary Mission? You talk about Unit 8200 is another one, right? Pegasus spyware, Project Nimbus. Some people out there listening might be thinking we're talking about the latest Hollywood movie or something like that. Hollywood is very busy too, propagandizing and through video games and everything, and we've talked about that. But talk a little bit about these this very sophisticated surveillance apparatus and the impact it has and the chilling effect it has also on expression. Omar Zahzah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you so much. I'm glad that you asked that question. And I'm glad that you kind of listed, Canary Mission, which is kind of one of the, I guess at this point you could say it's one of the OG anti-Palestinian blacklist sites, right? And for the longest time, it had basically operated under the veil of secrecy. But what it would essentially do is, anybody who was active in activism for Palestine, right, would start to be added to this blacklist that accused them, of being anti-Semitic, that accused them of essentially supporting terrorism. And it was an ever expanding kind of roster. And it, really, again, for the longest time, the point of it was that you weren't exactly sure who was doing it, right? And then you started to have over the years exposés from films like The Lobby, which you can still find online. But basically, it was revealed that this is really ultimately an Israeli kind of counterinsurgency tactic, right? And so you had things like the Ministry of Strategic Affairs. You have organizations that purport to be sort of just unaffiliated, but otherwise pro-Israel advocacy organizations that were sort of in on this as well. And so there's this vast apparatus of a blacklisting, spying, and ultimately trying to dox people to kind of move them away from engaging in pro-Palestine work or activism of any kind, really. And so, the one of the most surprising things, and I guess I shouldn't linger on this one for too long, but I will say that one of the most surprising things to me about Canary Mission is even though now it's kind of known almost as like something that people joke about, is that it had been sort of normalized and just accepted as kind of the lay of the land for so long. People were just sort of supposed to accept the fact that it was routine to be added to this blacklist with, very little done, right? And then, of course, as the receipts started to come through in publications like The Nation, where you find all of these supposedly philanthropic organizations, that are donating to it, you start to see more and more that, in fact, this is an across the board and even an internationally kind of sanctioned operation to blacklist and dox people, right? Unit 8200, you have the Israeli Cyber Unit, you have all of these different state-sanctioned colonial military formations that are essentially designed to use the internet as a tool of surveillance, to weaponize digital platforms and the internet, to really prohibit international activism and organizing as much as possible, right? So individual Palestinians, in the homeland themselves are repressed and surveilled, through um, Israeli suppression and monitoring of the internet, which there's a whole history to that. I don't know if we have time to get into it now, but hopefully in a future segment, we can actually talk about the history of the internet and how it's always kind of operated, as an arm of Israeli surveillance and colonization, even as it's allowed for some narrative ruptures, right? Um, and so what's happening, I guess, as I as I think about the way that you framed the question, what I'm realizing is you're having this kind of broad sort of recursive cyclical effect where what starts as a direct expression of a colonial digital surveillance project against colonized people, on the homeland proper, it's really moving outward and kind of closing downward upon all who would, on some level, stand in support. Right now, I don't want this to be misinterpreted. I don't want it to sound as though I'm saying that everybody's experiencing exactly what Palestinians are experiencing, right, in Gaza or in the West Bank, right? But what I am saying is that we're seeing the increasing normalization of surveillance, colonially sanctioned surveillance, and the demonization and the criminalization that comes from that surveillance. And so, what a lot of platforms are doing, right, is we're sort of normalizing the things, the tried and true tactics that are honed and tested in the colonial laboratory of Palestine and exporting it to the broader public. And so now, when we're thinking about terms of servitude, when we're thinking about the types of suppression, silencing, and the kind of criminalization that can come from having anti-Zionism all of a sudden stigmatized, is we're seeing that more and more the blacklisting that starts as something very specific to Palestine and Palestinian activism is becoming exported more and more to anybody who would support the cause. And so it's really important to understand that what we are acceding to through the untroubled use of these platforms is the increasing normalization of that colonial exportation.
Right. And Omar Zahzah, we're seeing that too with HR 9495, the coming attack on nonprofits, and the list that's already been the sort of made public is that it's mostly around this issue and mostly around allies of the Palestinian cause. It's very targeted and specific, in that way, and what they're trying to do and going after nonprofits, which is horrendous because so much of the independent media landscape operates under that model. It would be another very blatant attempt to censor, and to continue framing, more of an imperial colonial perspective. Omar Zahzah, we're out of time already in this segment. We could certainly be talking for a lot longer about these issues. Your book won't be out until summer, but it's Terms of Servitude, Zionism, Silicon Valley, and the Digital Settler Colonialism in the Palestinian Liberation Struggle. Where, if you'd like, where can people find more about your work or follow some of what you're doing, Omar Zahzah?
Oh, thanks. Thanks for that question, Mickey. I am on X, now Twitter. I am on Instagram just as at Omar Zaza. On X, it's at Dr. Omar Zaza. And I'm on Facebook as Omar Zaza. But honestly, although I write about these things a lot, I tend not to use these platforms very much. So I think the best way to keep in touch is actually keep a lookout for things in the Project Censor Dispatch, Palestine Chronicle, Mondo Ice, and Electronic Intifada, which tend to be the places that I contribute to as regularly as I can.
Well, Omar Zahzah, thank you so much for your time today and sharing your expertise with our audience. We'll certainly be catching up with you again into the next year.
Thank you so much.